In the quiet of a late hour, some lives feel far away, until a page brings them close again. Joan of Arc is known for banners and battles, yet her most lasting trace can be a set of court papers you can still read. This is Night History Story, and tonight we will follow a teenage peasant into a courtroom where every sentence was weighed. Please subscribe to Night History Story and comment a topic for the next video. Chapter 1. A Kingdom in Fragments. In early 1429, the Loire Valley and the roads to the south felt like a country of doors half closed. Along the rivers and hedged fields, stone bridges led to walled towns with barred gates and watchmen on wooden platforms. France was not simply at war with England, it was divided within itself, with rival loyalties that showed in coat colors, wax seals, and the flags over castle towers. In rooms lit by tallow candles, clerks laid out charters and treaties that said one thing, while soldiers in the street enforced another. The 100 Years' War had already stretched across generations, and by the 1420s, the struggle over legitimacy had hardened into paperwork and bloodless legal phrases. In 1420, the Treaty of Troyes named the English King Henry V as heir to the French crown, and it disinherited the Dauphin Charles, the son of the French King Charles VI. The document was read aloud in formal settings, copied by scribes, and pressed with seals that hung from cords. Yet the reality on the ground was a patchwork, with English held Normandy to the north, Burgundian influence through much of the east, and the Dauphin court pushed to the south and west. The city of Paris was in English and Burgundian hands, and the French royal court, such as it was, lived in a more cautious geography. Chinon, a fortress on the Vienne River, became one of the Dauphin's main refuges, with a long stone keep and chambers that smelled of smoke from hearth fires. Courtiers moved through corridors lined with tapestries and benches, watching who approached the prince and who carried letters stamped with the right seal. To many, the Dauphin cause looked tired, as if the ink was running out. Across the north, in English held Normandy, Rouen served as an administrative center, with its cathedral towers rising above narrow streets and timbered houses. English officials and allied clergy held meetings in large rooms with heavy tables, discussing taxes, garrisons, and the language of authority. Rouen had strong walls and a river port on the Seine, and it sat inside a region where English rule could feel routine, with documents filed, courts convened, and markets operating under watch. In such a place, legitimacy was reinforced not only by swords, but by a steady rhythm of records. The Burgundian faction, allied with England for much of this period, controlled key routes and towns, and their support made English success possible. Burgundian banners and livery appeared at gates and on street corners, and their nobles held councils with their own notaries and their own lists of obligations. The feud between Armagnac and Burgundian sides had its own history, with assassinations and revenge, and it deepened the sense that France was a contested idea as much as a contested territory. In that atmosphere, any symbol could become politically valuable, even a person. In late 1428, the siege of Orléans tightened like a rope around a river city. Orléans sat on the Loire, with bridges, islands, and stone walls that framed its churches and markets. English forces built bastilles, fortified positions of earth and timber, and placed guns that could send stone and iron into the city. Inside, defenders looked at ration stores, at piles of arrows, and at religious processions that carried relics through the streets, hoping the saints would notice their prayers. The Dauphin and his advisors faced a practical crisis and a symbolic one. If Orléans fell, English power could push deeper into the Loire corridor, and the Dauphin position might collapse further. Messages traveled by horse along muddy roads, and in the courtrooms of Chinon, men argued over strategy while staring at maps that showed too many losses. Some urged negotiation, others urged patience, and many watched their own careers as carefully as they watched the war. At this point, a young woman from a small village entered the story, not through a grand gate, but through rumor and local report. News in the 15th century moved by human voices and folded letters, by pilgrims, merchants, and parish priests. A claim could travel from a village church porch to a regional captain, then to a court chamber with carved beams. The claim attached to this young woman was unusual and dangerously specific, and it offered an answer to a court that had run out of good options. It is useful to remember, even here at the beginning, that much of what we know comes from the very documents that tried to define her. Later, those documents were copied, argued over, and reopened. The story begins as a rise in a landscape of fortresses and banners, and it bends toward a fall in a room where ink became a weapon. Along the way, the texture of the time remains visible in the objects that survive, like seals, court minutes, and the names of scribes. To recap softly, by early 1429, France was divided by war and faction, and the Dauphin cause looked uncertain in a court south of the main battle lines. Orléans stood under siege along the Loire, while English held Normandy, operated with the steady machinery of records in cities like Rouen. Into that strained setting, a village name and a young woman name began to travel on the roads. Chapter 2. From Domremy to Chinon. In the winter months of 1429, Domremy was a small place of fields, orchards, and a parish church with a simple stone bell tower. The village lay near the Meuse River in the borderlands of northeastern France, in a region where loyalties could be complicated and raids were not unknown. People warmed themselves near hearths, mended clothing, and listened for distant hoofbeats on the hard ground. A life there was measured by seasons, church days, and the work of hands. Joan of Arc was born in Domremy around 1412, though exact dates are not always firm in village records. Her family were peasants with some standing in the community, tied to the land and local obligations. In later testimony, witnesses described the home, the fields, and the habits of a young woman who could be devout and practical, familiar with church services and household tasks. The village church, the font, and the worn stones of the doorway appear again and again in recollections. Joan later said that she began to experience religious visions and voices in her early teens, often linked in her memory to specific places and sensory details. She associated them with a garden area near her father's house, with the sound of bells, and with the light around the church. The record of these claims comes mainly from court testimony, which means it is shaped by questions and by the need to respond under pressure. Some sources suggest she spoke of saints by name, and later chroniclers emphasized the miraculous, while historians continue to debate what can be known beyond her own words in legal settings. What is clearer is that by 1429, she believed she had a mission connected to the Dauphin and to Orléans. In a world where rulers justified themselves through sacred ceremony and inherited right, divine language mattered, and it could also be politically explosive. A young woman who spoke in that language could be seen as inspired or as dangerous, depending on who held the pen. The first steps toward the court involved local authority, because travel and access required permission and escort. Joan went to Vaucouleurs, a fortified town with a garrison, where Robert de Baudricourt served as a local commander for the Dauphin side. Vaucouleurs had walls, a gate, and a castle that stood above the town, and it was the sort of place where a captain judged requests with a hard eye. Accounts of the first meetings differ in tone, and some details are filtered through later retellings. Still, records suggest that after persistence and local support, she was allowed to travel toward Chinon under escort. The journey from the northeast toward the Loire region meant days on horseback, winter roads, and the practical risks of crossing contested territory. Riders carried cloaks, food, and letters of introduction, and they passed through towns where the color of a badge could decide treatment. Joan traveled in male clothing for the road, according to later testimony, a decision that would become central in her trial. In that moment, it may have been understood as a protective measure in a dangerous landscape, but later it would be used as evidence of transgression. By late February or early March 1429, she reached Chinon, where the Dauphin court kept itself behind stone and ceremony. Chinon had a series of fortified structures on a ridge, and within its halls, courtiers watched newcomers with suspicion. Later accounts include stories of tests and disguises at the first meeting with the Dauphin Charles. But those details are debated, and some may belong more to legend than to documents from the time. What is solid is that she gained an audience, and that the court decided to examine her. A theological inquiry took place at Poitiers, a city with a cathedral and university-trained clerics, where learned men assessed claims of divine mission. Poitiers had lecture rooms, church interiors, and clerical robes that signaled expertise in doctrine. The records of this examination are incomplete, and much of what is said about it comes from later testimony and summary. The outcome seems to have been cautious acceptance, with the court willing to use her presence as a sign of hope, while keeping advisors close. As she prepared to join military efforts, she was provided with equipment and a public image. She had armor made for her, and she carried a banner that sources describe in recognizable terms, though precise details vary across accounts. In a camp, armor pieces were laid out on benches, straps adjusted, and the banner staff held upright as a visible claim. Letters were drafted in clerical hands, and her name began to appear in the margins of official communication, a rare path for a peasant teenager. Her emergence mattered because symbols worked in wartime, especially in a kingdom where coronation and sacred ritual underpinned legitimacy. A figure who claimed divine support could rally towns, shame deserters, and unsettle enemies who feared they were losing more than territory. Yet the same figure could also become a target, because discrediting the symbol could weaken the cause. In that tension, the path from village to court already carried the shadow of a future courtroom. To recap softly, in early 1429, Joan of Arc moved from the village landscape of Domremy to the fortified towns of Vaucouleurs and Chinon. Her claims of visions were tested by clerics at Poitiers, and the Dauphin court chose to use her as a hopeful sign in a failing war. Armor, a banner, and letters turned a private conviction into a public role. Chapter 3. Orléans and the road to Reims. In late April 1429, the Loire country was green again, and the river moved past islands and mills under a wider sky. Orléans remained surrounded by English positions, with earthen ramparts and wooden palisades set like teeth around the approaches. Boats slipped along the water with supplies when they could, and inside the city walls, people gathered near churches and gates to watch for any change. On the roads outside, dust and hoof prints mark the movement of armies. Joan of Arc entered the Orléans story with a small force and a large reputation, arriving with her banner visible above helmets and spear points. She moved through camps where tents were pitched in lines and where captains argued beside rough maps laid on barrels. The siege had its own geography, defined by English bastilles, the bridge towers, and the open fields between. Sources suggest her presence helped unify morale, though the extent of her direct command remains debated, since formal military authority rested with experienced nobles and royal officers. The key events around Orléans in May 1429 unfolded quickly. Assaults targeted specific fortifications, and attackers used ladders, earthworks, and artillery in a familiar pattern of late medieval siege warfare. Joan was present at major actions and was wounded at least once, according to multiple accounts, though details of exactly where and how can vary. A scene that repeats in sources is the sight of her banner near the front lines, a cloth sign in smoke and shouting, though it is best to hold the image with restraint, since later narratives sometimes amplify drama. By early May 1429, the siege began to break, and the English withdrew from positions that had seemed secure. The lift of the siege became a turning point in French morale, and the bells of Orléans churches were rung in celebration. In a city street, banners could be hung from windows, and priests could lead processions under carved stone portals. The practical importance was clear, and the symbolic importance was even larger, because it suggested the Dauphin cause was not doomed. After Orléans, the campaign continued along the Loire, aimed at clearing towns and securing crossings. Places like Jargeau, Meung-sur-Loire, and Beaugency became names on dispatches and seals, each tied to a bridge, a wall, and a gatehouse. In June 1429, the Battle of Bataille brought a sharp French victory, often described as a reversal of earlier English tactical dominance. The field itself would have looked like any summer farmland, but the outcome shifted the sense of what was possible. This string of successes created an opening for a political move, as well as a military one. The coronation of the Dauphin at Reims was essential to the traditional legitimacy of French kingship, because Reims Cathedral was the ceremonial place linked to sacred oil and ancient rite. Reims lay in a region not fully secure, and the road there passed through towns that might resist. Yet momentum, negotiation, and fear of being on the wrong side led several towns to open their gates. In June and July 1429, the army moved north and east, passing through places like Auxerre and Troyes, where the sight of armed men at the walls forced quick decisions. Chronicles described negotiations at gates and a tense waiting in fields while envoys went in and out. In some cases, the threat of assault mattered, and in others, the power of the coronation idea mattered more. A crown was not only an object, it was a legal signal that could reshape alliances. On 17th of July 1429, Charles was crowned king as Charles VII in Reims Cathedral, beneath high vaults and stained glass that colored the stone. Clergy in vestments moved through the choir, and nobles stood in ranks with swords at their sides. Joan was present, and later tradition often placed her close to the king with her banner, a visible emblem amid candles and incense. The ceremony did not end the war, but it changed the story the war told, because it affirmed a contested legitimacy with public ritual. After Reims, the forward movement slowed, and the political environment grew more complicated. The court had advisors who favored cautious diplomacy, including dealings with Burgundy, and there were internal rivalries over strategy and credit. Joan urged continued action, according to sources, and she remained a powerful symbol that could be difficult to manage. In late summer and early autumn 1429, French forces attempted operations near Paris, and Joan was involved in an assault that did not succeed, after which the court turned toward negotiations and winter planning. In the months that followed, the war returned to a slower rhythm of garrisons, truces, and contested towns. The image of Joan in armor, on horseback, carrying a banner remained vivid in memory, but her position in the political machinery was not secure. A symbol can be celebrated and still be expendable, especially when councils meet behind closed doors around a long table. By the end of 1429 and into 1430, the sense of inevitability faded, replaced by the older uncertainty of a long conflict. To recap softly, in spring and summer 1429, Joan of Arc became bound to the relief of Orléans and a rapid series of victories along the Loire. The road to Reims ended in the coronation of Charles VII in July 1429, under the cathedral vaults that signaled legitimacy. After that peak, strategy tightened, negotiations returned, and the space around her role began to narrow. Chapter 4. Capture and the path to Rouen. In the spring of 1430, the northern roads were again busy with patrols, wagons, and rumors. Towns like Compiègne sat on rivers and trade routes, guarded by walls, gates, and watchtowers that mattered as much as any open battlefield. The conflict around Burgundy, England, and the French crown was still active, and local campaigns could flare and fade quickly. In such a setting, capture could be as decisive as a battle. On 23rd of May, 1430, near Compiègne, Joan of Arc was captured during a skirmish or a retreat, depending on how one reads the accounts. The scene is often placed near a town gate and a bridge area, with horsemen and foot soldiers moving in tight space. She was taken by forces aligned with Burgundy, and she became a valuable prisoner, not only for money but for political advantage. A prisoner of this kind could be used as leverage, and her symbolic status made her especially sensitive. The politics of ransom and custody mattered immediately. High-status captives were often ransomed, with sums negotiated through letters and intermediaries, and such transactions could be recorded in contracts and receipts. Joan was not a noble, which complicated traditional norms, but she was linked to the French crown as a symbol, which raised her value in another way. Some sources suggest there were opportunities for the French side to attempt an exchange or ransom, but the record is incomplete, and historians debate what was possible and what was attempted. While she was held in Burgundian custody, she was moved between places, likely in castles where stone rooms, barred windows, and guarded doors defined daily life. Later testimony speaks of attempted escapes, including one leap from a tower, though details and interpretation vary. Such a story, if true, conjures a specific image of height, masonry, and a desperate calculation. But it is wise to keep it measured, since medieval records can compress complex events into short phrases. What is clear is that she did not regain freedom. Eventually, she was transferred to the English, a shift that turned her fate toward a different legal system and a different set of priorities. The English administration in France, especially in Normandy, had reason to discredit her because her success had boosted the legitimacy of Charles VII. If she could be labeled a heretic or impostor by an ecclesiastical court, her past victories could be reframed as deception. In late medieval politics, a court sentence could be a tool as sharp as a sword. By late 1430, Joan was brought to Rouen, the English-held city in Normandy. Rouen had a castle, often called the English Castle, with stone walls and enclosed courtyards where guards controlled movement. The city streets were narrow, with timbered buildings leaning over the lanes, and market stalls under awnings near church squares. The Seine flowed nearby, and barges carried goods and messages that connected Rouen to the wider English administration. The trial that awaited her was ecclesiastical in form, but deeply political in purpose. It was led by Pierre Cochon, the Bishop of Beauvais, a cleric aligned with the English cause who sought jurisdiction over her on the basis that her capture occurred within his diocese. The court also involved Jean Lemaitre, a representative of the Inquisition, whose participation was used to strengthen legal credibility. Assessors included theologians and canon lawyers, men in robes who sat on benches, listened and advised, creating the appearance of broad clerical consensus. In the castle of Rouen, the setting of confinement mattered. Joan was held under English guard rather than in a church prison, a point that would later be criticized in rehabilitation proceedings. Accounts suggest chains and close surveillance, though the exact conditions are described differently across sources and testimonies. The physical environment was stone, iron, and locked doors, and it shaped the pressure of every interrogation, because safety and comfort depended on men who were not neutral. The court structure included notaries and scribes, whose role was to produce a record that could stand as evidence. The notary, Guillaume Manchon, is often named, along with others such as Guillaume Boisguillaume and Nicolas Taquel, men trained to set down words with careful attention. In a courtroom, their tools were quills, ink, and parchment or paper, and their authority came from procedure. The presence of these record keepers is one reason the trial remains so vivid, because it left a detailed transcript texture that most medieval lives do not have. The interrogation strategy aimed to trap Joan in contradictions and in statements that could be judged heretical. Clerics questioned her about theology, obedience, her visions, and practical matters like clothing. they sought to control language, asking for yes or no answers to complex spiritual claims. Joan, a teenager with no formal schooling in Latin theology, responded with quickness that surprised some assessors, and the record preserves both the pressure and the improvisation. Even before the main sessions, preliminary hearings and procedural steps shaped what would follow. Charges were drafted and revised, consults were held, and witnesses discussed what she had said and done in earlier months. In a chamber, papers could be spread on a table, the names of saints and towns written in ink, and margins filled with notes. The trial, in other words, was built like a file, and she was placed inside it. To recap softly, in May 1430, Joan of Arc was captured near Compiègne and moved through a chain of custody shaped by Burgundian and English politics. By late 1430, she was in Rouen, held in a castle under English guard, while an ecclesiastical court formed around Bishop Pierre Cauchon and a panel of clerics. The stage was set for a trial where the questions were designed to produce a verdict that could travel as a document. Chapter 5. The Rouen transcript. In early 1431, Rouen was cold with damp air rising from the Seine and settling along stone walls. Inside the castle, rooms held the smell of ink, wax, and smoke from braziers, and guards' footsteps echoed in corridors. On certain days, Joan was brought into a hall or chamber arranged for questioning, with clerics seated, officials standing, and notaries ready with quills. The atmosphere was formal, controlled, and built to make her words belong to the court. The main public sessions began in February 1431, with Joan brought before a panel of assessors. The seating mattered, because authority was visible in the raised places, the arrangement of benches, and the central chair of the presiding cleric. Joan stood or sat under supervision, in clothing that drew attention and became part of the legal frame. The court asked about her name, her origin, and her family, pressing her to define herself in terms they could use. From the start, the court sought to draw her claims into categories of approved doctrine or forbidden error. They asked about the voices she claimed to hear and the saints she associated with them, trying to determine whether she might be deceived. They asked where and when the voices came, in what light, and with what signs, details that the notaries could capture as a sequence. Joan described experiences tied to specific places, like the church and the garden, anchoring her memory in everyday village scenes. One of the most famous lines of inquiry centered on obedience and authority. The clerics wanted her to submit her revelations to the judgment of the church, and they defined the church in a way that placed their court above her conscience. Joan often agreed to respect the church in general, while resisting any statement that would force her to deny what she believed God had commanded her. The tension shows on the page as repeated attempts to force a clean answer where none was safe. The court also pressed her about the sign she claimed to have given to the Dauphin, now Charles VII, when she first met him. They wanted details that could be mocked as superstition or framed as fabrication, and they wanted to expose any political maneuver as spiritual fraud. Joan was cautious, and she did not give them the full account they sought, saying at times that the matter was private or not to be disclosed. The record notes this resistance, and it reveals a mind that understood the courtroom as a trap. Another major theme was clothing especially her continued use of male dress. In a medieval religious court, clothing could be treated as a sign of moral order, and it could also be a tool of humiliation. Joan connected her choice to safety and to the demands of her role, describing the practicalities of travel and guard presence. The court framed it as disobedience to divine law and custom, returning to it again and again, as if a garment could carry a verdict. The strategy also involved complex theological questions posed in simple language. They asked whether she knew she was in a state of grace, a question designed to corner her, since claiming certainty could be judged presumptuous, while denying it could undermine her claim of divine mission. Joan responded with careful phrasing, refusing the trap and turning the issue back to trust in God. The record preserves the rhythm of this exchange, and it remains one reason readers feel close to the scene, because it is the sound of a mind working under pressure. Notaries played a central role in shaping what we can still read. During sessions, they took notes in French, capturing answers as best they could in real time, and later they produced more formal Latin minutes, a process that could smooth or standardize phrasing. Some parts of the surviving record show corrections and procedural markers, the kind of details that reveal a working document rather than a polished narrative. The presence of multiple hands, multiple languages, and later copying means historians read these pages with care, looking for the texture of the original hearing behind the formal surface. The cast around Joan included more than the presiding bishop and assessors. Men like Jean d'Estivée served as a promoter, pressing the case, while theologians such as Jean Beaupère asked repeated questions. There were also figures who tried, within limits, to advise her, including some clerics assigned as counselors, though their access and influence were restricted. Even the room itself, with who could enter, who could stand close, and who controlled the door, shaped what could be said. As weeks passed through March and April 1431, the court shifted between public sessions and private hearings, increasing pressure and narrowing options. Joan asked at times to be allowed to hear Mass and to have more direct spiritual care, requests that intersected with her confinement under secular guard. The court emphasized obedience, the danger of error, and the need to renounce claims judged suspect. Through it all, the written record grew, page after page, each with names and procedural phrases that anchored the extraordinary in the ordinary machinery of law. In May 1431, the process moved toward sentence. Articles of accusation were compiled, summarizing her words and actions into a form that could be condemned, and these articles were read and discussed among clerics. In a room with documents stacked and tied, the language of accusation turned living speech into fixed propositions. Joan was confronted with the choice to submit, recant, or face the final penalty of the court. On 24th of May, 1431, at the cemetery of Saint-Ouen in Rouen, a public scene was arranged, with a platform, clerics in vestments, and officials present. Accounts suggest she was urged to accept an abjuration, a formal renunciation, and that she made some form of submission, though the exact content of what she agreed to and what document she marked is debated. Some records indicate she made a mark on a short text, while later claims suggest the longer version was not what she understood and these differences became important in later review. The event shows how a legal document placed in front of a frightened person under guard can become the hinge of a life. Soon after, the court judged that she had relapsed, meaning she had returned to prohibited behavior or belief, in part connected to clothing and the conditions of her confinement. The record describes the shift in status, and in the logic of the time, relapse closed the path to leniency. On 30th May 1431, at the Old Market Square of Rouen, the sentence was carried out. Contemporary accounts and later testimony describe a public execution with clergy present, a cross held up for her to see, and the remains later disposed of, likely into the Seine, in an effort to prevent relic taking. The telling of that final morning can be restrained and still clear. It took place outdoors, in a market space framed by buildings and watched by authorities who wanted a public conclusion. A young woman who had once ridden with a banner now stood on a constructed platform, surrounded by officials and guarded space. The trial pages ended, and other pages began, because in the years that followed, people returned to what had been written. To recap softly, in early 1431, the Rouen court questioned Joan of Arc in sessions recorded by notaries, building a transcript that still carries the cadence of pressure and resistance. The clerics aimed to trap her in statements about authority, visions, and clothing, while she answered with caution and quick intelligence. In late May 1431, the process moved through abjuration and relapse to execution in Rouen, and the record became the central witness that could not be silenced. Chapter 6. The case reopened. In the early 1450s, France had changed, and so had the roads between towns. English power had receded in many areas, and Charles VII held a firmer throne, with councils meeting in more stable rooms and with fewer urgent retreats. Rouen itself shifted hands in 1449, returning to French control, and its castle and cathedral now stood in a different political light. In that calmer setting, the question of the old trial became newly practical, because the legitimacy of Charles VII had once been challenged by the sentence against the woman who helped crown him. An initial inquiry began in 1450, ordered by Charles VII to examine the circumstances of the condemnation. The details of this early investigation are less complete than the later rehabilitation process, but it marked a turning of official attention back toward the Rouen papers. Clerics and officials looked again at the court structure, the custody, and the procedures, with the castle rooms now remembered as sites of contested justice. The act of reopening a file in a different political era can change what the file means. The formal rehabilitation trial, often called the nullification trial, began in 1455 and continued into 1456. It was initiated with petitions from the family of Joan of Arc, including the mother Isabel Romay, and supported by a shifting coalition of church and royal authority. Pope Calixtus III authorized the process, and an inquisitor and theologian, Jean Bréhaut, played a key role in shaping the review. The procedure involved commissioners, hearings, and the collection of testimony, building a second great record that sits beside the first. Witnesses were heard in multiple places, and the geography matters because it returned the story to real ground. In Domremy, people described the village church, the local fields, and the young woman they remembered, speaking in plain terms about habits, piety and character. In Orléans, witnesses recalled the siege landscape, the city gates, and the morale shift, describing banners and processions in streets now rebuilt and repainted. In Rouen, participants and observers of the 1431 proceedings were questioned about the courtroom layout, the guard situation, and the conduct of Bishop Pierre Cochon. These depositions often had a different tone from the earlier interrogation transcript. The rehabilitation witnesses spoke with the benefit of time and changed power, and some could speak more freely about pressure and irregularity. They described how Joan was guarded by English soldiers, how access to counsel was limited, and how certain procedures did not follow ideal canon law practice. They also spoke about specific men in the court, identifying faces, robes, and the kind of influence that could be exerted with a glance or a whispered instruction. The commissioners examined the earlier trial record as an object, not only as a story. They considered how charges were framed, how witness testimony had been used or ignored, and how the threat of force might have shaped answers. They looked at the abjuration document and at the question of whether she understood what she was signing or marking, an issue tied to literacy and to the immediate pressure of the platform at Saint-Ouen. In a legal culture built on written proof, the question of what a page truly represented became central. On 7th July, 1456, the Rehabilitation Court declared the 1431 condemnation null, reversing the sentence and restoring the reputation of Joan of Arc. The decision was formal, announced with ceremony, and recorded in writing, with commissioners' names attached. The language of the verdict emphasized procedural faults and the corrupt motives of the earlier prosecution, reframing the first trial as unjust. In the space of a few pages, the legal identity of Joan shifted from condemned heretic to wronged figure, and that shift mattered for church, crown, and memory. The remarkable fact is that both processes left deep paper trails. The Rouen transcript preserved questions and answers with a rare immediacy, while the rehabilitation record preserved the voices of dozens of witnesses, describing rooms, clothing, and moments of decision. Together, they create a layered archive with different perspectives and different incentives, and historians return to them because they can compare, cross-read, and test claims against procedure. The case becomes less a legend and more a set of documents that can be handled, copied, and argued over. In later centuries, the survival and circulation of these texts shaped how Joan was remembered. The invention of printing and the growth of archival culture made it easier to reproduce trial materials, though full scholarly editions came much later. In the 19th century, editors and historians published major collections of the trial and rehabilitation records, and these printed volumes, thick with footnotes and Latin phrases, turned courtroom pages into modern reading. Art, theater, and later film drew on the image of armor, banner, and flame, but the most stubborn source remained the written transcript. Nationalism in France, especially in the 19th century, used Joan as a symbol of unity and resistance, placing her in paintings with polished armor and bright standards. Churches displayed statues of a young woman with a sword, sometimes standing near a stained glass window that colored her face in blue and red. Political movements of different kinds tried to claim her, and each claim often pointed back to a different set of documents, a different interpretation of the same recorded answers. The memory of Joan became a contested space, like a public square, with speeches replacing arrows. The church also shaped the long memory. Joan was beatified in 1909 and canonized in 1920, events marked by official decrees and ceremonies that echoed earlier legal forms. Even then, the trial transcripts remained important because they contained the closest surviving record of her voice as she navigated authority. Modern historians, whether focused on gender, politics, religion, or law, keep returning to Rouen and to the pages that were written there. At night, when the noise of later centuries fades, the case can feel simple again. A teenage peasant entered a war as a symbol, then was placed in a courtroom designed to define and destroy that symbol, and the court left behind a record of its own methods. The papers survived regimes, wars, and shifting tastes, and they still lie in archives and printed books, lines of ink that carry both human urgency and bureaucratic calm. In that sense, the trial you can still read becomes part of the story, not just a source for it. To recap softly, in the 1450s, the condemnation of Joan of Arc was reopened in a changed France, and a rehabilitation process gathered witnesses and re-examined the Rouen record. In July 1456, the earlier sentence was declared null, and the case became one of the best documented lives of the 15th century. Over time, art and politics reshaped her image, but historians keep returning to the paperwork that preserves her in a courtroom chair. In the quiet after all these pages, Rouen remains a city of stone and river light, and Reims remains a cathedral where candles once marked a contested crown. The villages, bridges, and castles still have names that can be traced on maps, and the surviving transcripts still show the layout of power in a room. The story settles back into the archive, into paper edges and faded ink, and the night can hold it without judgment. Please subscribe to Night History Story and comment a topic for the next video.